Are you working too much? Are we all working too much? Today, we're talking about the idea of a 4-day work week. Especially since the pandemic, a lot of people want more life and work balance, that they aren't always tethered to their job, especially younger generations. Now, this is already a thing in Europe, but only now really gaining traction in the United States, even being part of demands for the recent UAW negotiations. If this is something we all wanted to do as a society, or individual companies or industries, how would we get there? What would need to happen? What are the different ways to implement a 4-day work week? How might it impact the overall economy? I'm Jairus Days, and for your Daily Detroit on Thursday, September 14th, 2023, my guest is Dr. Peter Berg. He's a professor of employment relations and director of the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations at Michigan State University and an expert in the space. As always, feedback is welcome at dailydetroit@gmail.com or 313-789-3211. So let's get to it. Dr. Peter Berg, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And thank you for making the time, because the idea of the 4-day work week and all of its permutations, because there's many modes that this could take, many forms, has come up with things with the pandemic, with shifts in work, with recent negotiations at various places. I've seen some of it in the creative field. I've heard people revile against it in the corporate world. I've heard so many opinions about this one on all sides. So I guess why don't we start with the base? Like, what is the genesis of the 4-day week, and why is this, to you, seeming to gain strength?
Well, I think it's gaining strength because there's a demand for flexibility, particularly for people under 40, 45 who really want to see a life where they can have non-work life and a work life better in balance. And so there's a desire for flexibility, and different working time models are attractive to people, and they would like to have more choice in that area, I think.
So what are some of the most popular models you're seeing out there?
Well, first, let me start by saying these kinds of workforce or lower work week models have been operating in Europe for decades and decades. Not so much in the United States, but you see that much more prevalent in Europe. And some of the models we could be, things you see even in the US, are 4 days a week, 10 hours a day. So you retain 40 hours in the week, but you work them, called 4/10s, 4 days a week, 10 hours. What this does is give people a day off, or a 3-day weekend, sometimes some day off during the week. So that's one model. Another model might be you work 4 days a week, 8 hours a day. So it's 32 hours a week. And again, you would have a day off. But the other model is to work 5 days a week with 7 hours. And so you're working 35-hour week, but you work fewer hours in each day. And I would just say the last option is something you see in Europe more, and that is choice, where people can choose the kind of schedule they'd like from a menu of schedules. That might be one that is 4 days or 5 days, or one where you say to the company, I will work for you on this set schedule. And if I do that, I might get more pay. Or I will work for you where you can adjust my schedule 2 weeks out and change my schedule as you see fit. And then there might be more vacation days that come to me as a benefit. So choice in schedule is something that's also an option out there.
When you talk about these different modes, and you mentioned Europe, I can't help but have flashbacks. You know, listeners may or may not know, but I've worked a ton of jobs, like corporate jobs, over the years. And to me, I just remember over the last 20 years or whatever, how much it was indoctrinated into me of like, if you work the minimum, you get paid the minimum. Like, I haven't worked less than 50 hours in 15 years. So for me, it's kind of processing that and thinking about, we were talking about this off air a little bit. You know, in my 20s, I was afraid to take vacation time because of the cultural expectation, because I wanted to move up. And I feel like there is a cultural rub here, generationally, depending on where you work, depending on how you worked, about this, whether it's the loyalty, the company, being productive, all those things. Any thoughts on that?
You see that in terms of vacation, big differences in the United States and in Europe, to draw contrast, where it can be quite common in continental Europe to have 6 weeks paid vacation. And the culture is that you take 6 weeks vacation every year. It's just accepted that you would do that. And that's people who are in professional jobs or in production jobs or in management jobs. In the United States, it's typical that someone might get 2 weeks vacation. And often in surveys, we know that people tend to take a few days less than 2 weeks every year on average. So why is that? What's the difference? Well, I think part of it is what you said, this culture of productivity, culture of commitment. Are you really committed to your job? Well, you can't be unless you work 50 hours a week. That kind of culture of commitment sends a signal to people. Hey, if you take vacation, you're demonstrating you're not committed and you could risk losing your job. We're in an employment at will environment in the United States, meaning, management will measure your performance, and if it's not measuring up to some metric, you can be released or laid off. In Europe, they have more employment protection, and I think that feeds into this view, and it's culturally different, that it's important to take all your vacation and use it. And it's not so much seen as a commitment barrier.
Yeah, I remember specifically a mentor talking to me about that specific thing, that if you're going to move up in certain companies, there's just a way that you have to be, a sacrifice. If you want to make over X dollars, then, kind of the company owns you and your time. And that's very different from, 20 years ago when I started my career versus now, where there is a huge generational gap where I know people who've just literally decided, well, this is the hours I'm working, and they will literally walk off the job if they're doing more. It's a whole different view of things, and it brings up a lot of other cultural issues too, I think.
I think you're right in that especially younger people have, in many of them, not all of them, what you see this more often is the value of time over money. What you're describing is that people will say, well, I value my time off and I value my vacation more than I value living up to your expectations of performance. And I'll risk not moving up as quickly or risk losing my job because I want better balance between work and non-work life.
Now, what about productivity? Some would argue or have argued that whether it's that commitment piece, whether it's there are certain things that just need to get done. How does productivity decline or add over time? And I'm sure it also depends on the kind of field that you're in too. If you're working building cars or working with a very physical job versus, something that is mental, but there's still fatigue in that. So can we talk about productivity a bit? Is there any studies around that? What does the data say?
If you're going to reduce the hours of workers, it can raise the per hour cost of labor. And when that happens, firms will look to shift to technology and automation as technology capital, and invest there as a way to gain productivity. And so what you see often in Europe, for example, is a lot more automation, a lot more technology within, say, a manufacturing process because of that labor cost, reduced hours. And what that does is increase the productivity of the process with that addition of technology and capital. And so management has incentives to do that. Now, what that might mean is maybe there are fewer workers needed in the future if the hours are reduced because of the technological introduction of technology and the productivity gains that come from that. But it isn't a given that productivity is just going to fall away. It's that management will shift and invest in other things to raise productivity.
Now, some listeners have shared with me that the idea might be that if you're working 32 hours or 4 days or however you slice it, depending on the model, that productivity near the end of those hours tends to wane. Is there any data on worker productivity like that?
I'm not aware of a study that shows productivity or effort is waning at 32 hours. The studies that I see are more or less that by reducing hours in the week, people have more time for rest and recuperation, and the benefits of more sustained effort over a shorter work week than a longer work week. Certainly productivity and effort will drop off when you get into the 45, 50 hours. But I haven't seen anything that shows that would happen at the reduced hours.
Okay. Now, what about the back and forth? We saw a little bit of this with the pandemic where you had people who would work a floor and they would have to come into work. And then you'd have white collar workers who would often be able to work from home. And we've seen all of these shifts with the whole, office space and on effects with that too. What about those kind of tensions? Is that something in a workforce or even as a society makes shifts where, say, one group of people is working 4 days, another is working 5? I also kind of hear at times from some listeners and family members of, well, I worked, 5, 6 days a week. Why can't you? Those kinds of things.
I think that gets back to the culture of performance. We do see generational differences where people would say, when I started in this company, I worked, 50 hours a week, but young people today, they don't want to work those hours. I think that just gets back to this idea of what they value. If they don't perceive the company as committed to them, then they're going to be less committed to the company and they may value the time over the money. I do think there are certainly differences in occupations. Professionals have more autonomy in the job. They often can flex their hours much easier than, say, a production worker that's tied to a production line, which you have to be present and there's a shift. But I would add that it doesn't mean you can't get flexibility within a production job. There are places where you can do shift swapping, where someone on the line could say, does anybody want to swap shifts with me on this Saturday because I've got a family event I'd like to go to? If you take my shift, I'll take yours. And you could do that electronically. You could do that in a shift swapping system electronically and allow people to pick and choose on their own. So there are ways to do that. We don't see that much. I've seen it or read about it in a couple instances, one with gate agents at an airport were doing that. So it's possible, and it's a way to gain some flexibility for those workers.
So it sounds like there's infrastructure solutions there. It's a matter of will and being able to try it and maybe kind of spread your wings a bit on it.
I think that a lot of this comes down to will on the part of management and, let's say, demands on the part of workers and unions who are willing to negotiate that. I mean, the UAW now has put in one of its demands a 32-hour work week. I don't know how high of a priority that is for them, given their other demands, but it's interesting that they're throwing that in there and putting it down in the list of demands. It's one way to get some flexibility.
Now, do you think this is a change that can happen? In your mind, do you look at this and go, in some years, this is the way that it's going to be? And what are the hurdles you see for maybe that shift from 5 to 4 days and whichever mode you end up picking?
I'll say this. Before the pandemic, a lot of these changes were gradual. The pandemic brought about a sea change, particularly in remote work and hybrid schedules. All of a sudden, people were working remotely and management learned they could be productive. People could be productive working from home. And so now they're like, okay, people are like, I don't want to go back full time into the office. I have tools. I have Zoom. I have Microsoft Teams. I can work efficiently here. So a lot of hybrid scheduling. Well, you come in 2 days a week, you work at home 3 days a week, or 3 days in, 2 days at home. And so this now is becoming more normalized. And I think it opened the door to consider other flexibility models. So if you combine that with the demands and interests among younger workers in more flexibility, I do think some of this is possible. I do think it will take institutional changes too, though. It will take changes as a part of some of our laws, particularly around the Fair Labor Standards Act, which requires businesses to pay time and a half over 40 hours a week in actual pay. So there could be some changes needed there as well.
So it could start with some negotiations or individual places, but for it to be more widely adopted, you think that there needs to be legislative action.
Yeah, I'd like to see legislative action that supports flexibility more and choice. One of the ways that Germany provides flexibility to its employees is they will say in their models, the standard work week here is 36 hours, but that is an average over 6 months. Some weeks you might work 40. Some weeks you might work 34. But on average, you will work 36. And we will total up all the hours that you work and see how much more over the average you worked. And that will be put in a time bank. And you will be able, as an employee, to withdraw from that time bank hours as paid time off. Not as overtime payments to you, but as paid time off. And that gives the employer a lot of flexibility to ramp up hours of work and to ramp down hours of work when they need it. And that's the benefit to the employer. The benefit to the employee is increasing a time bank where they have paid time off in their accounts. And they can take it to retire early, or they could take it as vacation time or family time and things like that. That kind of a model, I think, has benefits that we're just not really able to utilize here in the United States.
I mean, I'm sure to some listening, it would seem like I guess it is literally a foreign concept, but I know so many people in my family and others, and I've done it myself where, you're working a job and you're measured week by week, day by day, every 2 weeks by every 2 weeks. And if you're more than, a little bit off, you get told about it. That's just so embedded, especially, I think about like service workers and some line workers, things like that, especially line workers or production workers that don't have union protections. I'm just looking at this and I think about the culture versus strategy or culture versus policy thing that is going to need to happen with this. And I feel like a lot of this, it is going to be starting to work on that cultural question.
I think so. I think one of the cultural shifts would need to be a performance-based approach to workers rather than a time served. If people are just counting the hours you're in, they're not really counting your performance. They're not paying attention to that. To the extent can be, I just care that you get the project done, that you do the work, rather than where you do it, how you do it, or how long it takes. And if you meet the deadlines necessary to complete that work. So that's a very different approach and allows for more time flexibility than simply, I'm going to count up your hours and you got to be present. I need to see you. That's more supervisor control over the person than the work.
Now, I know that you focus on the labor side, but do you have anything to add on, say, concerns about inflation? I know that there's kind of this idea like, well, if you're going to raise all these workers' wages or have to use more workers or all those other things, could this impact inflation in a negative way where I feel like there are a lot of people who are concerned about it right now?
I think that the idea of, are we going to see what's called cost push inflation, that rising wages will lead to rising prices and they'll be passed along. I think some of that really depends on, is demand growing for products too? Because if demand is growing, then you're going to see that those prices will be absorbed in growing demand. And we wouldn't necessarily expect to see rising inflation. I'm not that concerned that time reduction will lead to a lot of cost push inflation.
So, before I go, like, what are some of the tips around, if you're somebody who wants to see this at their workplace or how to approach it? Because I feel like it can be kind of scary. In my mind, I think back to those days in my 20s where I shared, like I just didn't take vacation time. I feel like that can be sometimes a difficult question to have or conversation to bridge.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because as I'm trying to think about where does someone get the models to go to their employer, or if you're an employer to say, well, I'd like to think about those things, where are the models that I could do to do that? And I think a lot of those are in Europe, but a lot of these models around working time, there isn't one place to do it. There isn't one place. I can't say go to this government agency and you'll get a lot of models. So I'm going to do something crazy for your listeners and say, if you're interested in doing that, contact me. I'll help you figure some things out. Now, I might be insane for doing that, but I think I could give you a good place to start and look.
You know what I should ask is how they can contact you.
So you introduced me at the very beginning as I'm a professor in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations at Michigan State University. And if you go to that school on the website, you can search us. You'll find me on the faculty there and send me an email.
And I will put a link to that page in the show notes. Dr. Peter Berg, I really appreciate you spending this time with me because I feel like, I opened up my eyes to a few different things on this. I really appreciate it.
Sure, happy to do it.
As always, feedback dailydetroit@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. And thanks to our members at patreon.com/dailydetroit. We're going to be doing some Patreon exclusives soon, within the next 30 days or so. I think we're finally able to make that happen. I'm looking forward to it. With that, I am Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.